Thank you very much. I am excited to be here, and I want to thank the United Nations and Noor and Richard and Jim for this opportunity. Although I must admit to you, I have a little bit of trepidation or perhaps a bit of frustration. I just wish that there were a large MRI piece of equipment that could measure all your brains to see which parts of them are actually firing while you sink into that after lunch stupor. But I keep droning on. I'm just wondering what part of the brain I'm going to register with. What I would like to do in the next half hour is just raise some questions about something I think we too often take for granted. We often talk about the advances that are going on in neuroscience. And we've heard a lot about these already today. But one of the questions that keeps coming back to me, and I'll tell you why in just a minute, is how do we know their advances? I mean, where actually is neuroscience going? And is it going where we would like it to go? Or we would hope it to go? Or we anticipate it to go? So in other words, which way is forward for neuroscience? Or to build on something Jim said earlier, to what end are we pursuing this particular science? What is it we hope to achieve? And so with that in mind, what I'd like to do, as you heard, I am not a neuroscientist, I'm a geneticist. So I would like to bring this afternoon a little bit of our experience. Because if you can think back about, say 10, 15, 20 years even, there was another science back then that was on the forefront of everything. And everything was named after that science. It was genetics. And so we had gen ethics, right? And genetic economy and everything else. And so we were the big boy on the block. All right? So we're a little jealous. Neuroscience is pushing us to the side. All right. These things happen. But there were a few lessons that we learned as we tread our path of ascendancy. One was that things don't always turn out the way you expect. You all remember, of course, the great research endeavor called the Human Genome Initiative, where the United States decided to put billions of dollars into the pursuit of sequencing a human genome, which at that time was a rather daunting task. And the thought was that when we did that, we would now be able to open the book of life. And this would tell us everything we needed to know about ourselves and about the things that we might want in our lives, such as health. Instead, when we finally cracked that code, we not only did discover that the genome wasn't exactly the book of life, it wasn't even a very good table of contents, but it actually caused a lot more problems than we expected. And this is a cartoon that was done shortly after the announcement was made in the early 2000s that the sequencing had been accomplished. And as you can see here, it's like one of those travel maps that you get. And you open up, and now you know where you think you are, but you can't get the map back into the way it was initially arranged. And it was a similar sort of experience. You had the map of the human genome opened up, and of course all these problems or challenges came out. And they were many, and they were diverse. There were a lot of different issues that were raised that required expertise well outside that of the genetic and genomic researchers. We raised insurance issues, medical health dilemmas, moral issues, privacy concerns, all kinds of legal tangles and policy problems. All that now needed to be addressed because of the science we pursued. So if that is what occurs when one tries to slice open the human genome, I think it is legitimate for us to try to anticipate what might occur as we slice open the human brain and the human mind, as we go about delving into the information and the revelations that may lie there. Because my presumption would be, as I think has been pretty consistently throughout the history of science, we will discover some things that we thought were not possible. We will discover some things we never even thought about, because we didn't even have the imagination to think about them. And we will find out that some of the stuff we thought was true wasn't. So how will we go about wrestling with this challenge. And exactly who is the we that will be involved in that conversation? And again, I think we can turn to the experience of genomic researchers in that regard. This was the title given to a conference we held this past January at Georgetown in conjunction with the Department of Health and Human Services here in the United States. And the idea for this conference came out of the experience of some researchers in genetics. After we discovered that the human genome was much different than we thought it was, and that we really didn't get the kind of information we wanted out of sequencing the 4 genomes that were sequenced for that project, it was decided that the answer would be to go around the world and sequence the genomes of people that represented groups that were relatively different from other people, in part because they had been isolated in some way from intermingling with other groups. Now, it just so happened that a lot of these groups belong to the category of what we call indigenous peoples. Small communities of people that have been somehow sort of overrun by the expansion of certain nations around the world. And they had been sort of marginalized, in a sense, within the social structure and social fabric. And so the genomic researchers went to these communities and said, do we have a deal for you? You give us your biological information, and we will tell you where you came from. And they thought for a second, and oftentimes the answer that they gave was, well, we know where we came from, so why don't you go back to where you came from and leave us alone? Needless to say, the genomic researchers were a little confused by this response. First of all, how could they know where they came from if the genomic researchers didn't know where they came from? Because after all, that was going to be the answer. And secondly, who were they then to decide what should go forward? And so it raised 2 very interesting questions. When we talk about knowledge, where does our knowledge come from? Our knowledge of ourselves. If we're talking in this discussion today about this connection between brain and mind and person, are we thinking about those concepts, as we heard already from Dr. Farah, in the same way? Do we use the same information? How then might we go ahead, forward, in a way that may actually involve a very rich discussion of what that means, to move ahead? And so the idea of this conference was to bring in representatives from these communities and to ask them, along with some genomic researchers, is there a way that we can move wherein everybody thinks they're benefiting? And fascinating in the process of this discussion, some very interesting things came up. And these were just 4 of the dominant themes that came out of our discussion. One, when the researchers decided to engage these communities, did anybody ask them if they wished to be engaged, especially around this topic? Did anybody think that the structures we might bring to those communities as ways of protecting them would not be seen by them as appropriate for their own traditions and their own ways of seeing their protection? One area this came out was the idea of informed consent. Now, many of you know in research today, especially biomedical research, this is one of the key underpinnings to doing research on human subjects ethically. You get the person who is going to be the subject of the research, you explain the research to the person, all of the potential pitfalls and harms, and you give the person the choice, the informed choice, to consent to being part of the research program or not. Well, in many communities around the world, this makes no sense, because individuals do not decide things of that significance, because they do not see themselves as somehow separate from their close relatives or even their community. So it is a communal informed consent. Well, how does one do that? That's not in our protocol. I don't have to have that when I put this before the IRB. But maybe our IRB isn't the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, that should be reviewing this research. Why doesn't the indigenous community have a say in what counts and what doesn't count? And how are they going to have that say when rarely can you find members of these communities who are active researchers themselves, or who have people who are aware of the dynamics of biomedical research, and also of what we hope to achieve by doing the research? Because perhaps that community is not even interested in those particular benefits which we hold so dear. And so ultimately the idea was, if this is going to go forward at all in a way that is truly constructive across the board, then both sides need to engage in a constructive dialogue. Training has to go both ways. We often talk about educating people so that they will understand the science. And I think that's absolutely necessary. Equally, if not more necessary, is training the researcher so that they understand exactly what it is they're doing, not in their own mind, but in the minds, as we have heard earlier today, of others. Because after all, it is the other we are interested in. And we need the other. We in genomics certainly need the others to even come to an understanding of what it is that we think we have discovered. So the question is there what's often called common ground? Are there shared values and goals that we can point to and say, okay, in the vast majority, if not all, of the groups that we engage, we find these particular things to be important. One of the things, obviously, that we hope for is the importance of health, right? And I think just about every human community around the world considers health to be important. And oftentimes, a lot of the research that we've heard today and a lot that we hear in biomedical research is oriented toward that goal. But the question is, where exactly does that goal fit in the panoply of all the goals that a community might have? How important is health? Now, many of you may actually think health is of extreme importance. I think that's something we all believe we think. But interestingly, if that is true, do we really listen to what our research tells us? As we heard earlier, I think from Dr. Pfaff, if you want to have a healthy brain, there are certain behaviors you should follow and others you might avoid. I do believe there's this little compound. It's called ethanol. It might be good in sort of moderate amounts. We're not exactly sure to what extent. But probably many of us at some time or another have gone beyond a particular limit of healthiness. In fact, even our caloric intake, as we've come to understand, is probably, maybe 1.5 to 2 times what it should be. Any of you want to start eating half of what you eat now? I thought you wanted to be healthy. So exactly where does this fit in our panoply of values? How much do we care about health? Can someone have a good life and never be healthy? I think so. I think most of us would say yes to that. What then does that mean? So what are the ultimate goals? And how then could research in some way serve those ultimate goals? And how would health then fit under whatever those ultimate goals are? Whether one has a short lifespan or a long, whether one has, in a sense, exemplary brain and neural activity or not. Whether all the pieces are there or some are missing. How then does all this fit into that larger picture? And that is not to say that science and technology are not extremely important in how we understand even the larger picture. But they may not truly be as dominant as some of us in science would like. And it also may lead to some very interesting sort of behaviors that we would not have predicted. One example of this is a religious community that many of you may be familiar with, the Amish. They're in various places around the United States, but one place is in southeastern Pennsylvania. That community happens to struggle within their ranks of a relatively high incidence of a metabolic disease called Crigler-Najjar. Now, it's not so important what the disease is as what the potential treatment for the disease was. Because back in the 1990s, when people were trying to figure out ways of using our vastly improved ability to manipulate our genetic material, how could we perhaps do gene therapy on certain diseases, especially diseases that had what we would consider to be a recessive mutation, one single mistake in the spelling of the allele of the gene? And is there a way in which we could fix that? Now, to which groups would you go and offer the possibility of engaging in this kind of research? I think most people would have figured the Amish. They don't want technology. They don't want cars, radios, TV. Why? Because they're afraid of the effect these things can have on something which is more valuable to them, their community. And yet that community decided to pursue the possibility of genetic interventions on their own children. Absolute cutting-edge technology for the Amish. How can that be? Because the health of their children was to them a greater value than the risk of embracing this particular technology. So as we engage in this constructive dialogue, we need to be open to different ways of seeing things, ways in which we ourselves don't see things, ways in which we don't even imagine we might see things. And it is important in that pursuit of this broad conversation to understand how the communities themselves work. How do they see themselves? What does it mean for them to be person, to be people, to look to see what science and technology might bring to them that they would want, if anything? And how do we, as a community, as a scientific community, as a nation, as whatever community you wish to draw the lines around, how do we ourselves work with other groups that don't operate the same way, that don't see things the same way, don't come to the same conclusions that we come to? Because there will be differences. Within and among communities, there will be differences. Within our own families, there are differences. Right? So the human condition is rife with differences. Well, human history is also rife with ways in which people attempted to address those differences. Sometimes constructively, sometimes destructively. Let's be aware of those and why in the past we've chosen one option over the other. So that we know, for instance, if we're engaging a community, do they have a more centralized authority structure, or is it distributive? Obviously, that would make a huge difference. One way in which, of course, makes a difference for me is I belong to a religious tradition that's very hierarchical. And we engage religious traditions that are not. So we have to understand our own inner workings of the Roman Catholic Church versus the inner workings of certain Protestant churches, or Islamic traditions, or Jewish churches, all which operate somewhat differently. You have to know yours, and you have to know theirs. And then when you are looking at decision-making within those communities, what counts as evidence for the way we reason to a conclusion? I very much appreciated Dr. Pfaff's discussion of parsimony in his scientific theory. And parsimony is usually something that's fairly broadly accepted. The fascinating thing is, That's a value that can be brought from many different perspectives. So from a religious perspective, one could say the parsimonious approach would be to say, science doesn't matter. Why? Because I can tell you all the things you want to know about morality without using science at all. Right? What am I supposed to do and not do? God's already pretty well laid that out. Right? So there you have the explanation. Right? How then do I explain to people predictions, whether or not you agree with what God has told you to do or not? Piece of cake. Right? If you don't do that, something bad is going to happen to you or your children. Right? That's a hard prediction not to come true. And do I have to show causality there? No. It's an empirical argument. Right? Now, can I go from explanation and prediction to influence? Absolutely. Right? That's the whole idea of having a moral code in a religion, is to influence people. Equally effective, equally parsimonious, no science. Now what do we do? Well, then the question again is, what's the goal? To what end are we having this discussion? And if the goal is to engage the other communities, then we have to ask ourselves, why is it we came to such different conclusions than they? Why? Because I'm a scientist. So what do? I use scientific evidence. I use as evidence what I can quantify. They're a religious tradition. What do they use? Scripture, revelation, tradition, precedent. Great. I didn't see anything in there that I was going to be able to measure with an fMRI. So when we engage people, I think this gets back to that modest epistemology or epistemological modesty that Dr. Farrar mentioned. It is something that's been called by different names in philosophy. William Alston calls it the risk of epistemic chauvinism, that you think your way of looking at something is obviously the better way. Why? Because it's yours. Of course, it must be the better way. So this is, again, one of the challenges that we need to face, and bringing into consideration all the things that other people decide are important to them and give evidence for the reasons that they use and the conclusions to which they come. So when we do pursue this constructive engagement, is this going to be something of fundamental value for us? Or is it of instrumental value? We're only doing it in order to get the biological samples. Once we get the biological samples, we're not so much interested in it anymore. Once we've gotten what we want, I don't really care so much what they want. Because that too will obviously have a significant effect on how all of this moves forward for all different kinds of communities. And we have many examples of this in our own country here in the United States. You know, Democrats and Republicans sitting down and talking about bipartisanship, and that lasts just as long as it gets close to a vote. Because basically the idea is, if you want to stay in Congress, you have to be reelected. Right? So bipartisanship does not get you reelected. Partisanship gets you reelected. So again, how do we move ahead with these things? One last example I have here, I had just recently, I was fortunate enough to be out in the wonderful state of Hawaii with a lot of the public health geneticists out there. Well, public health geneticists see things a lot differently than molecular geneticists see things. And they're not too happy about the fact that most of the research money goes to us and not to them, especially since they might actually have more health impact than I would. Now, either I can acknowledge the reality and the truth of that, or I can just run back and write more grants for my lab. So is there a way in which we can picture this movement into the future that will allow everybody to get on board? Well, I think one way people try to do that is they talk about the need to have this kinds of research, the need to move ahead and push back the frontiers of our ignorance, because we're racing against disease, right? Think of all the people we could help. Think of the people we could save that today we can't. Think of the suffering that we could alleviate if we could just move further. And so I ask myself, well, that's very interesting, but exactly what kind of race do we think we're running when we talk about this race against ignorance or race against disease? Now, I would imagine a good number of you could probably identify one of the figures in this photo. He's had a bit of public relations attention recently, especially since he keeps doing this, coming in first. This is Usain Bolt from Jamaica, a rather remarkable young man who seems to have a very interesting physiology that allows him pretty much to just run away from everyone else. Now, so Usain has obviously gotten a lot of accolades and attention because of his success. Anybody know this person? Or this one? Or this one? Or how about this one? No? Well, this is the World Championship. I mean, this is like the 4th, 5th, and 6th fastest person in the world. And you have no idea who they are unless you're related to them. Is this the kind of race we're running when we talk about racing against disease? Let's chalk off another disease that we can now treat in some expensive and high technology fashion. And once we've done that, let's move on to the next one. And let's not worry about who comes in 4th, 5th, or 6th. Just to cure that first patient is where we're focused. Is that the kind of race that we have in mind? Because again, the empirical evidence would seem to be somewhat stacked up against us. Many of you are familiar with the World Millennium Goals that are supposed to come to fruition by 2015, cut in half the people who suffer from a lack of clean drinking water and sanitation, reduce the disease burden for a group of other very serious diseases around the world. This, as you can see, is from 2006. We were already far behind then, and I'm guessing the recession hasn't helped us any. What kind of race are we running? Is it one where a few win and many lose? Or is this a race to get everybody across the finish line, even if those at the front have to go a bit more slowly? That's the question that we have before us. The statistics are there. The evidence is irrefutable. How do we address these challenges from this perspective of ultimate value? Values that we're looking to see if we do indeed share. Well, one of the responses I've had when I bring up this side to the question is, well, come on, this is nothing new. The poor are with you always. There are always people dying from these kinds of things. So really, you're comparing apples and oranges. And actually, I don't mind that so much because it's all fruit. And I'm just looking to see what the fruit of our labors is going to be. Are we going to help the more or help the few? What are our goals? And do they dictate how we go about doing what it is we claim we are to do? So another way of looking at this that people sometimes bring up is, well, when you're doing cutting-edge research, it takes a while to trickle down. And that's true. Now, obviously, it takes a while to sort of take a finding and really be able to scale it up to where it's able to be distributed more widely. But I have a question then. If the biggest bang for our buck that we could get in healthcare still today is clean water and sanitation, how long has it been since we've had sanitation technology? Now, I used to think that the first civilization that really employed this was in the Indus Valley about 2,500 years ago, but I was corrected by a historian. Apparently on Crete, the Minoans were already working on a system of sanitation where the rains would help clear out the streets and homes and flush all the sewage out into the ocean. 3,000 years. Half the people of the world. This is trickle down? So when we use these reasons, when we ourselves use these reasons and this kind of argumentation, does the evidence support our arguments? Does it actually make our position look more reasonable, more consistent, more applicable than those communities with whom we are engaging? Are we truly the intelligent ones at the table? Well, whether or not we are, obviously we need to be there, as well as everyone else. Because I think really we've gotten to a point now where technology is moving so fast and in so many surprising ways that we can't just leave it to one group to decide what's the good or where we should go or which way is forward. But that we need, in fact, to realize that everybody needs to be invited to the table. Now, for many of us, we live in a situation of what we call pluralistic and diverse democracy. Look around the room. There are many people here from many places. They represent many backgrounds, maybe many different ways of looking at things and different value systems. How do we engage? This is what the UN is all about. How do you engage this sort of conversation? And importantly, nobody should have a privileged position. There is no privileged perspective. And I would argue that, at least here in the United States, there's no privileged religion except one: political correctness. I wish my religion had that kind of faith power. Boy, people believe in that without ever questioning. So I think we need to get away from that too, and be aware that even some of the arguments we think are so obvious and clear, in fact, when looked at very rigorously, fall quite short. So as I mentioned, I think everyone needs to be invited to the table. Doesn't mean everybody has to come, but everybody gets an invitation. And once you're at the table, there's just a few ground rules. Nobody gets to dictate to anyone else. Everybody is responsible for a robust and rigorous explanation of their own positions and how that position then engages others. So that as we look ahead, we look for something I think is more than what we've perhaps settled for in the past. I would suggest that we not settle for some kind of lowest common denominator consensus, because that just finds the things among our positions that happen to be the same. I want to learn from others. I want to know things I don't know now, so that I might actually, with them, be able to come up with a way that neither one of us could have independently. So maybe we need to, as we move forward, to shift our target a little bit and to look more for synergy and synthesis and integration of all these different ways of seeing and understanding and appreciating and valuing our complex human reality. And I thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to your questions. Thank you.